Hello and welcome. In this lecture, we will update the user repository with some additional functionality, create the password reset token service, and add a few more integration tests to ensure everything works correctly. We will reuse the forgot password branch. Since there should be no changes since the last lecture, we can simply check it out with the git command git checkout forgot password. As discussed, the service layer sits between the view layer, where the controllers sit, and the repositories layer, where the JPA repositories sit. To understand what changes we need to make to the service layer, we need to think what functionality we need for the Forgot My Password journey. When introducing this journey, we discussed that it starts when the user clicks on the Forgot Your Password link. This will take them to a screen where they can enter their email address so that we can send to their inbox a password reset token email. Now, let's think for a moment what happens when users enter their email address here. We need to search our database for a user with that email. If we don't find the user, the journey ends. If we find the user, we will create a new password reset token for the user and send them an email. So we need a method that, given an email address, creates a password reset token for the user identified by that email. This method actually performs two functions. First, it searches a user given an email. Since in the user entity we have defined the email attribute to be unique, this functionality is easy to implement through a finder method in a JPA repository. Then, it creates a password reset token for the given user and stores it in the database. This is a perfect example of a method that should be written in a service class. The question is, where should we write it? Since we are implementing the Forgot My Password journey, we will create a new service class called Password Reset Token Service. Before we do so, we need to add a finder method to the user repository. Currently, we only have a find by username method in this repository. We need to add a find by email method that accepts an email as argument and returns a user object. Let's also write an integration test in the user integration test class. In fact, we will rename the user integration test class as user repository integration test to make it more meaningful. I'm now going to copy the test implementation from the code I have prepared for this lecture. Feel free to pause the video and implement exactly what you see on the screen. The test is very simple. It creates a new user and then invokes the newly created findByEmail method, passing the user's email as parameter, asserting that the return object is not null. Now, we can create the password reset token service class under the service package. Again, I'm going to copy the implementation from the code I've prepared for this lecture and then I'll talk you through it. Feel free to pause the video and implement exactly what you see on the screen. Also, in case you have problems with the code, you can always refer to my GitHub repository. You can do this by cloning my repository and checking out the branch that we're working on in a particular lecture. For this lecture, you will check out the Forgot Password branch. Then, you can compare what we have written with what I have written, knowing that in my branch the code works fine. You can also participate in the course forums or send an email to e-learning@devopsfolks.com. The service class is pretty simple. We have annotated with the @service and @transactional annotations. We have auto-wired a user repository and the password reset token repository. We have also auto-wired, so to speak, the token expiration property that we have declared in the application.properties file during the previous lecture. Finally, we have implemented the create password reset token for email method that takes an email as argument and returns a password reset token object. The method declares the return value and sets it to null. It then invokes the newly created method findByEmail on the user repository. If a user was found, it creates a new password reset token object and asks the password reset token repository to store it in the database. Otherwise, it logs a warning and returns null. Now, we can write an integration test for this new service. First, similarly to what we have done with the repositories integration test, we will create an abstract class for the service integration tests. We will call it abstract service integration test. Then, in the user service integration test class, we will set the user service attribute to protected. We will then extract a method from the test create new user method up to and including the point where it invokes the user service createUser method, and we will call it createUser. We will have this method accept a testCase object as argument, making sure we update the testCreateUser method to pass this argument. We will then set its visibility to protected. Next, we will make the user service integration test class extend the new abstract class that we have just created, and we'll pull up both the user service attribute and the createUser method. At this point, we should run the testCreateUser method and verify that it goes green. Now, we can write a new integration test class for the password reset token service. We will call it password reset token service integration test, and we'll have it extend the abstract service integration test class that we've just created. I'm now going to copy the implementation for this class from the code I have prepared for this lecture, and then I'll talk you through it. Feel free to pause the video and copy what you see on the screen. The test is very simple. It auto-wires a password reset token service and declares a test name object. Then, it creates a new user by invoking the createUser method in the parent abstract class. This is just to get us a user in the database. Then, it invokes the createPasswordResetToken4Email method on the repository, passing as parameter the newly created user email, asserting that the returned object is not null and that it has a primary key. Following on our journey and imagining that we have implemented the full forgot my password functionality, at this point we will send an email to the user with the token that we have just created. Users will click on the link and will be redirected to the DevOps Buddy website, where the application will check if the token exists and is not expired. We already have a method that finds a password reset token record given a token. What we don't have is a findByToken method in the service layer, so let's add one. The method is as simple as returning the password reset token repository findByToken value. At this point, you might be wondering why do we need a service method that just invokes a repository method. Couldn't have we just invoked the repository method directly? It's a good question, and one that deserves a bit of an explanation. When writing multi-layered applications, it's important to keep the layers consistent and isolated. The view layer should talk to the service layer, and the service layer should talk to the repository layer. Why, you might ask? I'm going to ask you a question. Imagine that the view used the repository layer directly. What would happen if, say, tomorrow you decided to use another data sink, maybe a NoSQL database or the file system? Now, you will need to change both the view and the service layers. If we keep the layers consistent and isolated, in such a case we would need to change only the service layer. The view layer, where the controllers sit, wouldn't need to change, and that's the reason why we want to keep the layers architecture consistent. As an exercise, you can write an integration test to verify the correct behavior of the findByToken method in the service that we just added. As a hint, the test will need to create a password reset token for a user, and then invoke the findByToken method on the service, asserting that the return value is not null. Continuing on our journey, let's assume that we have found a token and that it's valid. Now we will present users with a page where they can change their password. You can see the screen on the slide that I'm showing. The actual form might slightly change from our final solution, but the content will not. Users will now enter their new password and click the Submit button. At this point, our application will need to update the user's password. To do this, we will need a service method to update the user password. We could do this in different ways. For example, we could pass to the service layer a user object and a new password, and the service layer could invoke the save method on the JPA repository. As a reminder, the save method either inserts or updates a record, depending on whether the primary key already exists. Alternatively, we could just pass to the service layer the user ID and the new password. I prefer the second method, as there are smaller objects flying around. Additionally, it will give us the opportunity to introduce updates using the @query annotation. This method belongs to the user service, as we are changing the user's password. First, we will add a new method to the user repository. We will declare a void update user password method which accepts a user ID and a password as arguments. I'm going to copy this method implementation from the code I have already prepared for this lecture, and then I will talk you through it. Since this is a method that updates the database and for which we will need to use an @query annotation, we will need to annotate the user repository with the @transactional annotation. The method is annotated with the @modifying annotation to indicate to the JPA engine that the content of the @query annotation will change the database state. You will also notice the use of the @param annotation preceding the argument's declaration. Here, I want to show you that if we use the @param annotation in the @query, we can use parameter names rather than a question mark and the parameter order. Apart from having clearer benefits in terms of readability, this approach allows us to pass the arguments in any order. In the query, I then use the parameter name to match the @param value. The query executes a simple update on the user's password. Now that we have this method, we can write an integration test to check that it works. I'm going to copy the test implementation. Feel free to pause the video and implement what you see on the screen. It's also important that you understand what you see on the screen. If there is something you don't understand, reach out to the course community and you will find someone willing to help. The method creates a user, invokes our newly created method to update the password, and then retrieves the user again from the database, asserting that now the user's password is the one that we have set as new value. Finally, we will need to add an update user password method to the user service layer. I'm going to copy the implementation from the code that I've prepared for this lecture and then I'll talk you through it. The method receives a user ID and a new password as arguments, encrypts the password using the password encoder that we have defined in a previous lecture, and invokes the user repository update user password method that we have just created. As an exercise, you can write an integration test in the user service integration test class to test the new method that we have just added. That's it. We have now a solid service layer to expose to the view layer, which we will be implementing in the next lecture. Before closing the Git flow workflow, we want to make sure that all integration tests pass. Then, we will push the current code remotely with the git commands git add *, git commit -m updated the service layer, and git push. Then, we will merge to develop with the git commands git checkout develop, git merge forgot password, and finally git push. In the next lecture, we will change the UI and view layers so that we can put the whole forgot my password journey together and test it front to back. Thank you for your time, and I see you in the next lecture.